Kayamika walked slowly through the crowded market of Okirika, her old sandals scraping against the dusty ground. The market was alive with voices, traders calling out their prices, women bargaining for vegetables, children chasing each other between the stalls. But as she moved from one corner to another, some eyes followed her feet. Her sandals were worn thin, patched more than once, and almost breaking at the straps. A few traders nudged each other and laughed quietly, but one man's voice rose above them all. Yuzo, the loudest and proudest land dealer in the town, pointed and shouted, "Some people's poverty even follows them on their feet." His words cut through the market like a whip. Laughter broke out from his friends as he puffed his chest with pride, enjoying the attention. Kayamika lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear, but inside her heart trembled. She had been mocked before, yet each insult carried its own sting. She wanted to walk faster, but the stares burned into her back. Yuzo leaned closer to his friends and added, "How can someone like that ever dream of owning land? Even her shoes are tired of her life." The laughter grew louder, and Kayamika quietly clutched her basket tighter. Though her heart ached that afternoon in the market, Kayamika kept her face straight. She did not want to give Yuzo or his friends the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She had lived with people mocking her for years, and she had learned to hide her pain in silence. Deep inside, however, each word still felt heavy, like a stone pressing against her chest. Yuzo had made her a target many times before. He was proud of his wealth and never missed a chance to remind others that he was the richest land dealer in Okirika. He wore fine clothes, drove flashy cars, and walked around as if he owned the whole town. To him, mocking Kayamika was a way to show power, to prove that people like her, simple, quiet, and humble, did not belong in his world. Kayamika often wondered why he hated her so much. Perhaps it was because she never begged him for help, even when he expected it. She carried herself with dignity, even when her clothes were plain and her shoes were worn. And that dignity, in a strange way, threatened his pride. As people laughed in the market, Kayamika stood still for a moment, pretending to check the tomatoes in her basket, but her ears caught every cruel chuckle. A few women who knew her well looked away with pity, but no one dared to defend her. In that moment, she felt both invisible and exposed, like the whole market had turned against her. She wanted to run, but she forced her feet to move slowly, step by step, until she left Yuzo's circle of laughter behind. Walking home, she whispered to herself, "One day they will understand." Her heart ached, but her spirit refused to break. Even in her pain, she carried a quiet strength, the kind that did not need to shout back or throw insults. She believed time would tell her story better than her voice ever could. Yuzo's voice carried across the market like the sound of a drum, loud enough for everyone to hear. He planted his feet firmly on the ground and raised his chin with pride, his gold wristwatch glinting in the sunlight as he pointed toward Kayamika. "Land is not for people with shoes like these," he declared boldly. "Land is for men like me." His words rolled through the crowd, each one designed to cut her down. The laughter that followed was not just from his friends but from others who wanted to please him, who feared his sharp tongue and his influence in the town. Kayamika froze for a second, her cheeks burning as if the sun had dropped straight onto her face. She kept her eyes on her basket, but inside her chest, her heart was pounding. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the ground so that no one could see her old sandals anymore. Yuzo, noticing her silence, grew bolder. He spread his arms wide and boasted, "I buy land with one signature, I sell land with one phone call." People like her cannot even afford new shoes, let alone talk about property. His friends clapped and cheered as though he had just performed on a stage. The arrogance in his voice filled the air heavier than the smell of dried fish from the stalls. Even passers-by stopped to look, curious about the commotion. Some shook their heads quietly, not because they pitied Kayamika, but because they had grown tired of Yuzo's endless pride. Yet none of them spoke. His money had bought their silence long ago. Kayamika gripped the edge of her wrapper tighter, willing herself not to cry. She knew Yuzo wanted her tears, wanted to see her run. But instead, she took a slow breath, steadied her hands, and began to walk away. The laughter echoed behind her, but she did not look back. Yuzo smirked, believing he had won. He did not know that his arrogance that day would one day return to humble him in front of the same crowd that now cheered his mockery. What the people in the market did not know was that Kayamika carried a secret heavier than gold. Long before her mother died, Her late father, Obi Okafor, had called her to his bedside. With weak hands but a steady voice he told her, "My daughter, the land of our ancestors belongs to you. Guard it, protect it, but do not let pride destroy you." Obi Okafor had been a respected man, known across Okirika as one of the largest landowners in the region. His word carried weight, and his name still opened doors even after his death. Kayamika had inherited more land than Yuzo could ever dream of, but she never felt the need to flaunt it. While others built mansions and drove flashy cars to prove their worth, she chose a different path. She wore simple clothes, kept her mother's small house, and walked in sandals that reminded her of her humble roots. To her, wealth was not in showing off, but in preserving what truly mattered, her father's legacy and her own dignity. Many times buyers had approached her, offering large sums for her lands. She had quietly refused, choosing only to lease small parts when necessary. She had seen too many people lose themselves in quick money, forgetting their values. She wanted no part of that. Instead, she lived quietly, letting people underestimate her. Their whispers of poverty did not shake her, because she knew what rested in her hands. When Yuzo mocked her in the market, he thought he was humiliating a poor woman. But in reality, he was mocking the very owner of lands he wished he could touch. Kayamika did not need to prove anything that day. She walked away, carrying her father's blessing in her heart. One day, she knew the truth would speak louder than her silence, and when it did, the same people who laughed at her sandals would bow to the ground she owned beneath their feet. Kayamika entered the palace compound with quiet steps, her wrapper tied neatly around her waist and her modest blouse pressed clean. She carried no jewelry, no handbag, nothing that screamed wealth or importance. To many, she looked like an ordinary village woman who had simply wandered into a place meant for the powerful. Yet she had not come by mistake. The elders had personally invited her, though no one outside the council knew why. As she took her seat at the far end of the hall, Yuzo's sharp eyes quickly noticed her. He was seated in the front row, surrounded by businessmen and chiefs who laughed at his every joke. His face twisted into a sneer the moment he saw her. Leaning close to his companions, he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "What is she doing here? Maybe she came to sweep the hall or serve the drinks." His friends chuckled, covering their mouths as if they were ashamed, but secretly enjoying the mockery. Kayamika heard him clearly, but she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her face calm and unreadable. Inside, her heart raced, but not from shame, rather from the heavy weight of what was about to happen. She could feel her father's words echoing in her memory, reminding her of the land she carried in trust. Yuzo, satisfied with his small victory, leaned back in his chair, tapping his foot arrogantly as though he were the king of the gathering. People around nodded at him, eager to remain in his good graces. To them, Kayamika's presence was a mystery. Some wondered quietly, why would the elders invite her? But they quickly brushed the thought aside, convinced she was irrelevant. The drums outside slowed to silence, and the palace attendant announced the start of the meeting. The elders prepared to reveal the rightful landowner. Kayamika adjusted her seat, her hands folded on her lap. The moment she had long waited for was drawing closer, and soon, the same man who sneered at her old sandals would have no laughter left in his mouth.
Eva hurga hannen snette. Swas men amnger psu. Helo serpe bredel fashurla it. My hit all up nail at the tweel be there on over right on him from the girlfriend shitters for a shing gave me lots of fish that native knock. Ngesh ta will be but then I really. See if the feller and lamb see what zur fuzzy. Oh, cross me no fair listening out slash no one. Elmer that's fish that snashy. Ma, this your own fish. Obvious the road nice is church so as we sit such the thar bring you her wolf neil bark. Snine a man zero his dealer. Sash the right fap in the back that it's such as we. So I but was all would not be a weary get knock. Kate out the voice in it mates or shift it will serve it. Snammy got circuit light up snake obvious in our law for the lar but self real. Here if very sure him getting it on. Steeds are in the nerves. Hacker was no illush do he slur with the ill enough. Tharps her nutter dummy. Say, so I asked that snake a lark pilks she lops in it. Nessilgish dogs it. Her wolf always their old foot sarking if you set up busy. I am scow with a piece of sorry. Was we your nurse law on the ear rat snow. My hit all up on sit no milk game name one others. Snammy got the nassels are no off air with him. Hacker ich with a zero with a smear so we member for the starch that nail of a sure no it's all an outfit that you. That's he. Yeah, just snell out to the snail of a hang about there we're rat. Either with the direct silves it. Dwarf citral, and warp and do rocks and oddities. Your own fish today out we're law. Chief Nwari adjusted his cap and leaned forward, his deep voice echoing through the palace. The hall was so quiet that even the soft buzzing of a fly could be heard. This land, he began slowly, letting the words hang in the air, does not belong to any man who claims it by mouth. It belongs to the bloodline of the late Obi Okafor. The elders nodded firmly, confirming his words. The crowd stirred with curiosity, whispering among themselves. Yuzo's smile wavered, but he quickly straightened, still certain that his name would follow. Then came the words that shook the hall. Let Kayamika Nwakigo, daughter of Obi Okafor, step forward. For a moment silence swallowed the entire palace. Heads turned at once toward the back, where Kayamika sat quietly in her simple Ankara gown and old sandals. Eyes widened in disbelief. Kayamika, someone gasped. The same woman Yuzo mocked at the market, another whispered. The shock rippled like waves across the hall. Yuzo's mouth fell open. His confidence drained instantly, his face tightening as if someone had slapped him. He stammered. No, it cannot be. His friends exchanged confused glances, their laughter from earlier now stuck in their throats. The arrogance that had filled the hall minutes ago disappeared, leaving only stunned silence. Kayamika rose slowly, her hands steady, her head lifted high. The old sandals that had drawn so much laughter now carried her with dignity across the polished floor. Each step echoed with quiet power, as though the very ground recognized its true owner. She did not rush, she did not falter. She simply walked forward with the grace of someone who had always known her place. The elders gestured toward the table, waiting for her. People leaned closer, whispering in awe. She is the rightful heir? She owns the land. The truth landed heavier than stone, crushing every rumor of poverty that had followed her for years. And in that moment, the hall understood that the woman they once mocked. The air in the palace turned heavy the moment Kayamika's name was called. It felt as if the walls themselves were listening. The entire hall froze, no one daring to move or even breathe too loudly. Yuzo's smirk, which had decorated his face since the beginning of the meeting,
melted away like butter on fire. His eyes darted wildly from the chief to the elders and then to Kayamika, hoping it was some cruel mistake, but the truth was already sealed. Kayamika rose slowly from her seat, her wrapper brushing against the floor. Her old shoes, the very ones that had been mocked and laughed at in the market, carried her forward with steady steps. Each step echoed in the silent hall, making it feel as if time itself had slowed down. She did not bend her head in shame this time. Her chin was lifted, her eyes fixed straight ahead. There was no trace of fear on her face, only calm strength. Gasps broke out in waves as she walked past the rows of people. Some covered their mouths, others leaned toward their neighbors whispering, "Is this the same Kayamika? The woman with the broken sandals? How can she be the true heir?" Mothers nudged their children to look, elders shook their heads in disbelief, and the younger ones stared at her as though seeing her for the very first time. Meanwhile, Yuzo stood frozen in place, sweat beginning to form on his forehead. His hands twitched at his sides, and his legs felt suddenly weak. The man who once roared with arrogance could not even find his voice. The people who had laughed with him now avoided his eyes, pretending not to know him. Kayamika's walk to the front felt like a journey of victory. Every step she took washed away years of mockery and humiliation. By the time she reached the table, the hall no longer saw her as the poor woman in old sandals. They saw her as the daughter of Obi Okafor, the true owner of the land, and the woman destiny had chosen to humble the proud. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and carefully opened the brown leather folder, laying the crisp white documents on the polished wooden table. The red official seal gleamed under the palace lights, and everyone in the hall leaned forward, straining to see what would happen next. The room was so quiet that even the rustle of paper sounded like a drumbeat. Kayamika stepped closer, her old sandals making a soft scrape against the floor. She reached for the pen, her hand steady and confident. For a moment she paused, letting her eyes sweep across the hall. She saw the wide-eyed stares, the shocked faces, the whispers that filled the air like ripples in water. And then, without hesitation, she bent forward and signed her name. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper seemed louder than it should have been. To those watching, it did not sound like ink on paper. It sounded like thunder, like history being written in that very moment. With each letter she wrote, she erased years of mockery and replaced them with respect. When she finished, she lifted the pen and placed it gently back on the table. The lawyer nodded with approval, and Chief Nwori smiled proudly. The elders exchanged glances, some even murmuring blessings under their breath. But the most striking silence came from Yuzo. He sat rooted to his chair, his eyes fixed on the document as though it had betrayed him. His chest rose and fell quickly, his mouth dry. This was the very land he had boasted about, the land he had claimed belonged to men like him. Yet here was Kayamika, the woman he had laughed at in the market, signing it as the rightful owner. The hall erupted into murmurs, some in awe, some in disbelief. "Did you see her? She signed like a queen," one woman whispered. Another said, "Even her old shoes look powerful now." Kayamika stood tall, her head high, her face calm. At that moment, she was no longer just the poor woman of Okirika. She was Kayamika Nwakigo, the landlady whose quiet strength. Yuzo's eyes followed every stroke of Kayamika's pen, as if the ink was draining life out of him. Each letter of her name carved itself deep into his pride, shattering the image he had built in front of the whole town. For weeks, he had boasted loudly that the land would be his, parading himself as the richest, the most powerful, the man who owned Okirika. But now, the truth was standing in front of him in the most painful form. The same woman he had mocked for her old shoes was the true heir. His chest tightened and his throat felt dry. The room seemed to spin. His friends, who had once clapped at his arrogance, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to know him. The whispers around the hall cut deeper than any knife. So all this time it was her land? And he laughed at her sandals? Ah, pride has destroyed him. Yuzo tried to stand tall, but his knees betrayed him. They buckled under the weight of shame, and he collapsed back into his chair with a thud. His agbada crumpled around him, his once proud cap sliding slightly to the side. Sweat trickled down his forehead, soaking his fine lace, until he looked nothing like the proud man who had walked into the palace earlier. His lips trembled as though he wanted to speak, but no words came out. Some people watched with pity, others with satisfaction. The same crowd that had once laughed at Kayamika now watched Yuzo crumble. A few shook their heads, saying, "This is what pride does. It blinds a man until the truth breaks him." Meanwhile, Kayamika stood tall, her calm presence contrasting sharply with his broken posture. She did not gloat or smile at his downfall. She simply turned her face away from him, as if he no longer mattered. In that moment, the roles had reversed completely. The woman once mocked had risen, and the man once celebrated had fallen flat in front of everyone. The hall buzzed with restless energy as the shock settled in. People leaned toward each other, their voices low but urgent, like gossip too heavy to hold back. So all this wealth was hidden in the woman he mocked? One man whispered, shaking his head slowly. A woman beside him covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. "And to think we laughed at her sandals," she murmured. The disbelief in the air was so thick it was almost visible. Some people stared at Kayamika as if seeing her for the first time. The same woman who had always walked past them quietly in her old clothes, the one they thought was too ordinary to matter, was now standing as the owner of vast lands. Mothers who once pitted her straightened in pride, nudging their daughters and saying, "Learn from her, humility is greater than pride." Young men who had overlooked her shifted in their seats, regretting every time they had joined in the laughter. On the other side, Yuzo sat slumped, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His friends, who had always cheered the loudest at his insults, were now silent, their faces pale. None of them dared to defend him. Instead, they looked around nervously, afraid to be linked with his humiliation. The elders nodded among themselves, pleased that the truth had finally been revealed. "This is justice," one elder said softly. "The earth has spoken." Their voices carried weight, and the people in the hall murmured their agreement. Kayamika, however, remained calm. She did not bask in the whispers of awe or the sudden respect that filled the room. She only stood with her hands folded gently in front of her, her eyes steady, her posture firm. In her silence, she was more powerful than Yuzo had ever been in his noise. The crowd's awe turned into admiration. Many realized they had underestimated her strength, her patience, and her dignity. And as they continued to whisper her name, it became clear that the woman mocked for her old shoes had left an imprint on every heart in the. Kayamika stood in front of the table, the signed documents resting beside her. The murmurs of the crowd still floated through the hall, but she did not let them distract her. Slowly, she lifted her head and faced everyone, elders, traders, dignitaries, and even the children who had sneaked in to watch. Her voice was calm, but it carried clearly, filling every corner of the palace. "Shoes may fade," she began, her eyes steady, "but dignity never fades." The words rolled off her tongue like a gentle wave, yet they struck the crowd with the weight of truth. Silence followed, as though even the walls of the palace leaned in to listen. She let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. "Do not measure a person's worth by what they wear, or by what they choose not to show. Wealth is not in clothes or cars or gold chains. True wealth is in character, in patience, in dignity." Her words pierced the hall deeper than Yuzo's arrogance ever had. Some people lowered their heads in shame, remembering how they had laughed at her sandals in the market. Others felt tears prick their eyes, touched by the calm power of her voice. Kayamika turned her gaze briefly toward Yuzo, who sat slumped and sweating, unable to lift his head. She did not insult him, nor did she remind him of his cruelty. Instead, she said gently, "When you laugh at another's scars, be careful, because you may not know the crown they carry in silence." The hall erupted in nods of agreement, some even clapping softly. A few elders whispered blessings, and a woman in the crowd wiped her eyes, whispering, "She speaks like her father." Kayamika ended simply, her voice steady and calm. "Never look down on anyone, for the same ground you mock them on may one day belong to them." Her words sank deep into every heart present, leaving a silence so heavy it could only mean respect. From that moment, her voice became more than a defense. It became a lesson for generations to remember. From that day on, life in Okirika was never the same for Kayamika. The whispers that once followed her about her old sandals and plain clothes faded like smoke. In their place came greetings filled with respect. Traders who had laughed at her in the market now rose to their feet whenever she passed. Some bent slightly at the waist, calling her warmly, "Madam Landlady." Women who once pitied her now looked at her with admiration, telling their daughters, "Learn from her humility and strength." Even children who used to run past her without notice now stopped to greet her politely, their eyes wide with awe. Yuzo, on the other hand, could no longer hold her gaze. Whenever he saw her walking through the market or sitting quietly at the village square, he turned his head away, his pride broken. His once booming laughter had grown faint, replaced by a silence heavy with shame. The friends who had cheered him on began to distance themselves, no longer eager to stand beside a man whose arrogance had been exposed so publicly. Kayamika, however, carried herself the same way she always had, calm, simple, and graceful. She did not use her new recognition to boast or humiliate those who had once mocked her. She still tied her wrapper neatly, still wore her sandals until they wore thin, still bought her tomatoes from the same women in the market. But now every step she took was wrapped in honor. People whispered her name not in pity but in admiration. The elders often spoke of her in their gatherings, saying, "She carries her father's spirit, wealth with wisdom, power with patience." Stories of her quiet strength began to spread beyond Okirika, carried by visitors who had witnessed the day she signed the land papers. And while respect now followed her everywhere she went, Kayamika remained rooted in the same truth her father had taught her. Dignity is greater than riches, and silence can be stronger than 1,000 loud voices. The story of that day did not remain in the hall alone. It spread like fire through every corner of Okirika. People could not stop talking about the young woman in old shoes who walked with quiet grace, only to reveal herself as the true owner of the land that others fought to claim. Mothers told their children the tale, reminding them never to laugh at anyone because of how they looked. Traders in the market repeated it as they arranged their goods, saying, "Did you hear? The girl Yuzo mocked with her worn sandals is the real landlady." Even travelers who had only passed through Okirika carried the story to distant towns, adding their own awe to the retelling. It became more than gossip, it became a lesson. People saw in Kayamika the proof that dignity outshines wealth, and that patience carries a power far greater than pride. Those who once mocked her began to hold her name with honor, and her father's legacy lived on through her strength. Yuzo's humiliation was remembered too, but not in cruelty. It was told as a warning against arrogance. Everywhere the story was shared, it left a mark on hearts. It became a living parable, a reminder that appearances can mislead but true worth always reveals itself in time. And so Kayamika's name lived on, not as the girl with old shoes, but as the woman whose quiet strength turned shame into glory, and whose story became the pride of Okirika.